The creature leaned toward Bo, drawing in his scent. Bo refused to give it the thrill of his fear. He didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He knew where it would strike, somewhere soft and unprotected. His neck, his belly. He had to strike first, before his blood sprayed across the cobblestones and his guts hit his boots. But the monster chose a different place, a hard and armored place, one covered in a cage of bone. It reached out an arm and placed a clawed hand on Bo's chest. He had not expected that, and for a few seconds he froze. Only his heart moved, slamming against his ribs, beating out the rhythm of his terror. The monster could feel it. Its claws tightened, piercing his clothing and his skin, digging in as if it would tear his heart out. The creature's ears flattened. Its black lips drew back. Now, Bo told himself. Do it. Do it now. He drove his hands upward, aiming for the monster's neck, hoping to smash its windpipe. He was quick, and the strike was strong and well aimed. And had it hit its mark, it would have done damage. But once again, the creature was quicker. It saw the strike coming. Bo heard a scream of rage. He felt claws sink into him, felt his feet leave the ground and his body fly through the air. Then his vision exploded in a blaze of white, and he felt nothing at all. That's a quote from Beastly Beauty by Jennifer Donnelly. This is YA Book Chat, and I'm your host, Leah Stuhler. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of YA Book Chat. Thank you so much for being here and for listening. Today, I have another fabulous author interview for all of you. I am very excited to be speaking with Jennifer Donnelly today about her brand new book, Beastly Beauty. Jennifer is an author of books for all ages. She is a New York Times bestselling author. Some of her titles include Humble Pie, The Tea Rose Saga, These Shallow Graves, The Waterfire Saga, and then her fairy tale retellings, Stepsister and Poisoned, and now her brand new one, Beastly Beauty, which is also a fairy tale retelling. And Beastly Beauty will be publishing on May 7th, and it's being brought to us by Scholastic Press. Well, welcome to YA Book Chat, Jennifer. It's so great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me, Lee. I'm really excited to talk about this new book and just love to say a huge thank you to your readers. I'm sorry, your listeners for listening, listeners and readers.
Yes. Well, I am really excited to talk about the book too. But why don't you tell everybody a little about yourself before we get started?
Sure. Well, I'm a writer, clearly, as you mentioned. I write novels for kids and adults. And recently I've been sort of on a fairy tale retelling tear, taking apart three of my personal favorites, Cinderella, Snow White, and Beauty and the Beast, and kind of putting them back together in new and I hope unexpected ways. As a side thing, I'm also an obsessive thrift shopper. So when I'm not writing, and sometimes even when I am writing, I'm stalking clothing resale sites, hoping to score a designer find at a bargain price.
Nice. I like thrift shopping as well. Although what I really enjoy purchasing are like old vintage books. So like in my house, I have a bookshelf that's all, young adult books, but then I have an entire bookshelf that is all vintage books that I've collected over the years.
I'm very jealous. That's a wonderful thing to collect. I love old books. I find them at book sales. I find them in our local dump. People get rid of them, and I'm just always snatching them out. They're so beautiful.
Yes, I love them as well. I saw in your bio that you went to the University of Rochester, and I thought that was fun because I'm actually from Rochester, New York. I was born and raised there.
Oh my gosh, I did. I double majored in English and European history, and I am forever grateful to the U of R for many things, including instilling a lifelong love of Shakespeare in me. I had this amazing Shakespeare prof who was from Texas, and you have not heard Shakespeare until you've heard the to be or not to be soliloquy delivered by a Texan.
I can imagine that's interesting with his Texas drawl.
Wonderful.
Oh, well, I love Shakespeare. I'm actually teaching one of my advanced classes in school about Shakespeare right now. So we are getting into all of that, and it's very fun.
It is.
because Beastly Beauty is a fairy tale retelling, I wanted to talk a little bit about that, of course, and then some of your other fairy tale retellings too. And I've heard some authors who have written fairy tale retellings who have said that one reason they wanted to do a retelling was because there was an aspect of the original fairy tale that didn't really sit right with them, or because the main character doesn't have any power over their own story. Marissa Meyer is a very good example of that with her Rumpelstiltskin retelling. I've heard her talk about that. But what was it that drew you to writing fairy tale retellings?
I think for me, the process is all about taking this full-on, headlong, like running jump straight back into my childhood to the first time I heard these stories and all the questions I had then. And then taking a look around fairy tale land and trying to get some answers. And I think these stories want that. In fact, I think they love it. They are, old, sometimes ancient stories, but they're not dead and moldering away in a coffin. They're very much alive. And although they're written, for another time, of another time, they have meaning and relevance for our time. And I think they really want us to come back to them, to open the pages of a Brothers Grimm book and let them out and remake them a bit, kind of like, recutting a new dress from an old one so that they fit us here and now in our time.
I agree with you. I love fairy tales, and I often will. Now, I love Disney, but I will often look at the Disney movies and go, you kind of destroyed that fairy tale. Like, somebody who also really enjoys like the Grimm fairy tales and Hans Christian Andersen and like these original versions of them. Sometimes I look at Disney versions and go, what did you do? Those original stories are just so rich, and so sometimes it's just like they made it pretty, but it wasn't pretty.
Some of it was extremely dark, extremely challenging.
And I could tell from based on reading Stepsister and Poisoned, your other two retellings, as well as this one, that your stories do have influence from the original versions of the Grimm fairy tales. So tell me about how those fairy tales have influenced your retellings.
Well, I'd say fairy tales were a huge influence on me when I was a child, and they continue to be right now to this day. I remember clearly the librarian when I was small at my public library putting a Grimm's collection into my hands and how that changed me. It really opened my eyes because even though these tales are fantastical, they are so incredibly truthful. And when you're a young child, no one really tells you the truth about the world and what a hard and dark place it can sometimes be, because your parents and your teachers and the other caring adults in your life want to protect you from that, but not the Brothers Grimm. They give it to you straight. And I think they really confirm what we sense as young children, that yes, the world can be a dangerous place, a place that's full of monsters. But then these tales tell us that we can beat those monsters. They tell us that there will be times when we get lost, but they also say we're smart enough and we're brave enough to get out of those dark woods and to find our way home. And I think most of all, what these tales give us at the end is this incredible sense of hope.
Yes, and I love that. Like I am a sucker for just reading stories where even though there's this like horrible situation and this thing happening, there is still that glimmer of hope there. And you just want so bad for your protagonist to kind of see that and just grasp onto that hope during the story. And I just love seeing that. Well, before we get into Beastly Beauty, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about Stepsister and Poisoned, in case they're not familiar with those two, so that it kind of makes sense with your fairy tale retellings going into this one.
Sure. Stepsister is about Cinderella's two ugly stepsisters, specifically Isabel, the younger one. And in this story, I really wanted to find out why the stepsisters were called ugly. Who said so? And what did the stepsisters themselves think about that? Were they ugly because they had big noses and big feet, like the pictures of them that showed them in my little Golden Book story? Or maybe they were kind of awkward and not demonstrating the best manners, all of which certainly described me at 5 and sometimes still does. So I wanted to dig into this question of why we let other people stick labels on us. Who gets to decide who's ugly? And why do we let them do that? And maybe isn't it time that we, each and every one of us started defining beauty for ourselves? The inspiration for Poison was Snow White, and to me, the Queen and the Witch and the Apple, these things were all really scary in that story when I was little. But to me, the mirror was a lot scarier, and I wanted to know who was in there, and who made him the boss, and what did he want from the Queen, and why does she listen to him? Why does she give him this power over her? And ultimately, what does that voice in the mirror want from us? So those two are my first two. And for Beastly Beauty, I wanted to see what the consequences might be for a young woman who has really had to deny herself, deny her desires and her dreams and her emotions because society has made her do so. And what might happen when those desires and emotions finally burst free? So I really think that fairy tales endure for a reason. Again, these things are centuries, sometimes thousands of years old, and we're still coming back to them as kids and as adults. And there has to be a reason for that. And I think it's because they're sort of a trap door into the human psyche. They were a way of, explaining us to ourselves long before Freud came along and tried to do the job. And I think they still speak to something very primal inside of us, to our fears and our dreams, and to our very human need and longing for things like truth and kindness and love.
Yeah. And one of the things that I love specifically about your retellings is that, I always feel like I'm learning something from them. And, kind of like, because I feel like there's these just little pearls of wisdom scattered throughout each of the books that, tell me things that I didn't know that I needed to know, like how in Beastly Beauty, you mentioned how despair chokes out every bright emotion out of us. And sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, yes. Like, I'll read these sentences and be like, I've never thought about it that way before, but I need to think about it that way. And I liked how you say in Beastly Beauty, sometimes it's okay to be foolish because foolish people take risks. And you also said how it takes courage to love another human being. And when I read that, I was like, oh my gosh, I've never thought about that in that way before. So I love that your books do that. And, because like along with what you were just saying, I think that some people gravitate towards fairy tale retellings because they show us who we are. Like you even have a quote in the book that says, some say that fairy tales are a window that show us a make-believe world full of impossible creatures, but they are wrong. Fairy tales are mirrors, not windows. They show us in this world. They show us ourselves. And that's just exactly what happens with your three retellings, especially Beastly Beauty. I feel like for Beastly Beauty specifically, because that's the one that we're talking about mostly today. When you set out to write this book, was it your intention to kind of like help others in this way? Did the messages kind of more evolve organically as you were writing that? How did that develop?
It's a really interesting question. And I think the answer to it is both of those things. Books have always helped me, always. I mean, when I was little, when I was a teenager, and they still help me now. So I very much wanted to return that favor. I think teenagers do not have it easy. Teenagers have never had it easy, but I think the pressures are bigger and darker today than they were, during my time, primarily because of social media and the negative effect that it can have on a young person's mental health. So if I can try to help push back on that a bit, if I can give my young readers some armor and a sword, the tools that they need to fight the voices, sometimes those voices are external, sometimes those voices are internal, that tell them that they're not enough. That makes me really, really happy. And it makes me feel like maybe I'm repaying a little of the debt that I owe to all the writers who have helped me.
Like that's one thing, I recommend your books. I've been recommending your fairy tale retelling Stepsister and Poisoned because I feel like they do have such a strong message in them that is very empowering for young women, especially because, I remember growing up when I was a teenager and just seeing all these things and all these pictures and, videos of how women are supposed to look a certain way and handle a certain, act a certain way. And it's just so detrimental to our well-being. And in Beastly Beauty, you talk about there's a couple of quotes. It says, a girl who cannot control her emotions is no better than a beast. Or, for she had been told for so long that girls who felt too much and said too much did not deserve love. And I remember growing up and being told that I talked too much and that I was too much for people. And I'm like, like it was really hard. And I remember a lot of times feeling like I had to not dumb myself down, but I would be having conversations with people and in my head be like, oh, okay, I need to stop talking right now because maybe I'm saying too much. And it's just,
Yeah.
it's so rough. It is so detrimental to young girls to have all of these things surrounding them from so many places.
Telling them to be smaller, to be quieter, to take up less space, to, box themselves, to cut off pieces of themselves. I agree, Leah. And, with all young people, and I think with young women in particular, many of the same things that have always made women, in quotes, beastly, are still making us beastly today. For starters, the endless debilitating focus on a woman's appearance rather than on her abilities or accomplishments. And that comes from many places, social media being one of them. The pressure on women to play down traits that have been, I think, traditionally seen as more masculine, like competitiveness or pride or ambition. And I think it's really interesting how so many beastly terms have been and still are applied to women. I can think of a lot of them, like shrew, sow, cow, catty,
Mm-hmm.
vixen, nag, probably worse ones that I can't say on the podcast. And one of the many things that I love about Arabella, who's the beast in my story, is even though she desperately wants to break the curse that imprisons her, there's this small, contradictory part of her that really revels in being a beast. She loves the physical power and she loves the forest and running through the snow at night or crashing through an icy creek. And she likes to hunt and bring down a stag or snack on a
Mm-hmm.
chipmunk.
One of my favorite moments is when she is out in the forest with Bo and she tells him not to touch her rabbit. I laughed so hard. I was like, yep.
She's a little greedy when she's in beast mode. Yeah, she has, her snacks, her rodents, and she's trying to be nice, sure, but she doesn't really want to share.
No. Well, I don't think I had you do this yet. So before we go any further, tell everybody exactly what Beastly Beauty is all about.
Beastly Beauty is my gender reverse tale on Beauty and the Beast. In the classic version, the Beast is a man and he calls the shots and he rages and he shouts and he takes prisoners. And the Beauty is a young woman and she accommodates him. She denies her own wishes as she tries to understand him and help him become a better version of himself. Well, I'd had enough of that. I wanted to reverse the story's power dynamic and write the Beast as a young woman and the Beauty as a young man and see what happens. So I did. And I ended up with not one, but two difficult, damaged creatures who are both angry and wary and in a lot of emotional pain. And then I watched them as they worked upon each other and got under each other's skin and started to reveal the wounds beneath that pain. So this story is about Bo and Arabella, my two main characters, who are these two wounded people who are learning how to love each other and how to love themselves. But it's also about how we are all damaged creatures and how we all get trapped in these prisons of our own making, and how we need to learn to tear down walls and build bridges if we're ever going to get ourselves out of those prisons.
Which is a metaphor and literal in the book with building bridges.
Yes, it is.
As Bo discovers. But so, as you said, Bo and Arabella do have a lot of emotions that they're dealing with. So many different emotions for both of them and for different reasons because of the situations that they're in. So, tell me about developing these two characters and kind of handling all of these emotions because it's a lot.
It is. And when I was working on that part of the book, I was thinking back to my own teenage days and how huge and powerful my emotions seemed then, just overwhelming, and how they could, sometimes drive me and control me. So just like Arabella, my main character, we're all flawed and we all make mistakes and we can all become subject to our darker emotions at times when we do, like guilt and shame and anger. And we all have to learn that these emotions, however frightening they may feel, belong to us. And they actually serve an important purpose in our lives, these negative emotions, just like the more positive and sunny emotions do. And it's so important never to turn our backs on them. We really have to sit down and listen to them and find out why they are present and what they want from us.
Yeah, and I never really thought about it that way before. Like you always hear people say, well, don't bottle up your emotions and hold everything inside because then you're going to explode. But like that's it. That's all that people really say about it, or if you go to see a counselor or a therapist or something, you might, or even just watching on TV, the stereotypical is always like, just let it all out, but there's never really a good explanation for why we need to do these things, and
Yes,
so
that's true. And Arabella in the book really bottles it. She has to. She's forced to. She bottles her emotion, and it does explode out of her with very bad consequences for her and everyone else around her.
mhm.
And what I'm hoping is young readers and older readers too will take away this idea that it's very dangerous to do that, that it's hard for all of us, for me included, to confront these emotions, to confront my anger, to confront guilt and shame and all the rest of it. But it's so much better to do it than to ignore it and bury it, because these things fester.
Absolutely. It's always better, and I tell my son is 13. So we've just hit that teenager phase, and and he's been
Wrap
just
it in, Leah. It's a bumpy ride.
he's the first one. I've got one more under him who's 10. So I'm like, oh man, I don't know what I'm going to do when they're both in that stage. But even just with him, like he'll just be up and down. And, I'll just have to tell him it's okay. It's okay to feel these feelings and get them out and talk about it and understand it. Like, I would rather that you tell me if you're mad at me or whatever it is, because, we'll work through it and that's okay. Like, I don't want you to hold on to it and then explode later. So, yeah.
Yes, or read each other's signals the wrong way and miscue and
Mhm.
give each other miscommunications. It is so important to talk about it.
Yeah. And I even, so I'm a theater teacher and so I'm directing, I have to direct a show at school. And, and I tell my students too, or those who audition for the play, I tell them, okay, there's like 10 of you who want to be the lead, but there's one role. So, I say, I can only give it to one person. So 9 of you are going to be disappointed, and that's okay. I want you to feel those feelings, totally feel that, embrace that disappointment, but just take a couple of days if you need to. And then after that, come back and go, okay, this is the part I've got, and I'm going to embrace that and do a good job with it. Because I feel like it is so important to acknowledge those feelings and not just ignore them.
I could not agree more. And I think those are fortunate kids that they have a teacher like you in their lives to sort of
Mm.
help them through those difficult, potholes of adolescence and not getting the part and not getting the prize. It's hard. You have to
It is.
learn ways of doing it. You have to have some roadmaps. It doesn't come naturally.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's a lot of darkness that's in Beastly Beauty, literally, like from just darkness in the woods. But there's also darkness through with Arabella's and Beau's emotions and their grim circumstances. But we do also see faith, hope, and love in the story. So when you're writing, how do you balance the relationship between the dark and the light and the despair and the hope?
It's an interesting question. And I think in this story, the balance actually isn't there, at least not in the beginning and not for a long
Mhm.
time, because that balance isn't present inside Arabella. She is overwhelmed by darkness. She's overwhelmed by the negative emotions. And, the shame, the guilt, and the anger, they sort of conspire against her and tip her over into despair. And that is the most dangerous emotion. And these big feelings get her into their clutches when she had to let go of her dreams and her desires, and when she had to really turn her back on who she truly is. And she pushes them down, but she learns you cannot do that forever. If you try to, they will explode out of you.
Absolutely. And I love what you say in the book because there's a quote that says, without the light, we would not appreciate the darkness. There is good to be found in difficult feelings. How would injustice be stopped without anger? How would selfishness be curbed without guilt and shame? And that is just so true. And again, it's just something where we normally think about it the other way, the opposite way, like, well, if I need to appreciate the darkness in order to see the light, but it's not that way. It is the other way. Like we've been saying that, we have to embrace these difficult feelings because that helps us push further and change. It's so hard. Like when we get in these dark situations, you're right. Like we just fall into the despair, and that despair is so dangerous because we could just stay there for so long and let it take over us. But if we can learn how to actually appreciate this and then and work through it, we're going to be so much stronger at the end of it.
I agree completely. And I think, it's a message I'm very much trying to get across that darkness is a part of human life. It's a hard message to hear. I understand that, but we all experience loss. We all experience
Mm.
sadness. We experience setbacks and grief. We fall down, and we have to acknowledge that. And I think sometimes society conspires against kids understanding that, because you look around, everybody's smiling, or so you think. Everybody's happy. You look on, your social media, and everybody is living this amazing, bright, shiny, curated life. And you think, am I the only one struggling? Am I the only one, sad? Am I the only one who's angry? So I want to get that across to kids so badly that, life can be hard. Life can be dark. Don't push it down.
Mm.
Don't stay in it, but accept it. Have a dialogue with it. Find out what it wants from you, and then move on.
Absolutely. So you actually wrote a Beauty and the Beast story for Disney about Belle. And so I can imagine that was so much different. So what was it like? So you wrote that one and did that fun little story about Belle. And then what was it like to kind of come back now and come back to her, but in a totally different, like opposite way?
It was a very interesting experience. Disney commissioned me. This was a few years ago now, when their live action Beauty and the Beast movie came out. And they said, we would love you to write a little story that no one really knows, sort of come out of the timeline, don't disturb anything of the movie, go back in and tell us a little side story. So I did that, and that was lost in a book, and I loved it. I had so much fun doing that, but that was based, on the Disney version. And
Mhm.
I wanted to go back to an older version of it, a slightly darker version of it, and do my own version, I guess, like the Taylor's version of Beauty and the Beast, but the Jennifer's version. And, again, sort of approach it from a different angle and answer a question I've always had, which was, what would happen if we reverse these roles, if we swap the genders, if the the young woman was the beast and the young man was the beauty, and how would that work?
I feel like this is one gender swap I never would have thought about. Like Sarah Henning wrote a gender swapped version of The Princess Bride. And I was like, oh, yeah, I could totally see. Like, why wouldn't I have thought of that before? But and there are other ones too. You're like, oh, okay, yeah. But this is one I never would have thought, like, what would Beauty and the Beast be like gender swapped? But it works so well and it's fantastic. I love it.
Thank you so much. It's just, it has such a long and fascinating history, this fairy tale Beauty and the Beast, and it can be problematic and complicated at times too. I mean, the whole question constantly arises of, Stockholm syndrome and
Mm.
falling in love with your captor, and that sort of thing. And as I did research into the old tales, what I found about this one is that fairy tale scholars look at this original Beauty and the Beast tale as a way, this was written by a French woman, the original in the 1700s, as a way to prepare young girls for arranged marriages. I thought that was fascinating, because here you have a girl who's maybe 14 or 15, and her parents, pick a husband for her. And maybe that husband is a lot older. Maybe he's in his 30s. Maybe he has a beard and lives in a mansion or a castle, and he calls the shots, and maybe he's used to getting his own way, and maybe he's loud, and maybe he even backhands the servants. How do you survive that as a
Mm.
14 or 15-year-old when you have no education, no rights, no agency of your own. You live in your father's house and then you live in your husband's house. You don't have money. There's no such thing as divorce. How do you endure? How do you survive that marriage? Well, possibly by being sweet and kind and loving and hopefully changing that, in quotes, beast into a handsome prince. I thought that was amazing. And I thought that was a bit of an answer to the Stockholm Syndrome question. It's not so much falling in love with your captor as surviving in a situation you have no control over.
Mm-hmm. That makes so much sense. As soon as you said that, it was like a light bulb clicked, and I was like, oh my gosh. That makes so much sense that that's what that fairy tale would be, especially because, in thinking about some of the like Grimm versions and Hans Christian Andersen, I know that a lot of those I've done some research on them and looked into them myself. And I know a lot of them were done to teach children certain lessons. And so it makes so much sense that that's why Beauty and the Beast was written like that. I never knew that.
It's very interesting. And then, it goes through permutations through the centuries. It gets rewritten and then written again, and then, written again, and then becomes the Disney version that most of us know. But it's a very rich, deep, complicated tale. And I encourage readers to do the research and read literary historians on it, scholars of fairy tales, and dig into that richness. It's so rewarding.
We're going to wrap up, but I'm curious, of your 3 fairy tale retellings, and this is the last one you're going to do. Is that correct? I thought I saw that.
For the moment, yes. I've done 3 of them, and I need to take a little bit of a breath.
That makes sense. So of the 3, which one would you say was maybe like the most challenging to write?
Oh my gosh, they were all so challenging. I love the characters. I love, let me start up again. They are also challenging for me. Every book I write is challenging. I wish that would change. I've written a few books now. My career's progressed, and I keep hoping it will get easier, but it never does. And I think the most important thing, though, that I want readers to take from this current fairy tale, from Beastly Beauty, is, and I guess it's in all the other fairy tales too, this sort of thread running through them, is that we ultimately hold the key to our freedom and happiness in our own hands, and that no beast or beauty or king or princess can save us or doom us, because we ourselves, each and every one of us is the hero of our own story. And at the end of it, we are the ones we've been waiting for.
Yes, just like in Frozen 2, when Elsa has that moment in the ice cave, and that's what her mother says exactly to her. You are the one you've been waiting for. And I bawled my eyes out. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it's true.
Because that was like an eye-opening moment for me. Like, oh my gosh, it's so true. Yes. So I love that. It's such an important message. Well, I just want to say thank you so much, Jennifer, for being here and for chatting with me today. It was really a treat to have you on here.
It was my pleasure, Leah. Thank you so much. And again, thank you to your listeners for listening. And I hope they enjoy Beastly Beauty.
Yes. And for everybody listening, be sure to check out the show notes for today as well, because I will put links to Jennifer's website and her books, and where you can purchase Beastly Beauty as well, which again will come out on May 7th. Well, thank you everybody for listening today, and we will chat again soon. Today's podcast episode featured the book Beastly Beauty by Jennifer Donnelly. I'd like to say a special thank you to Jennifer for coming on the podcast and chatting with me today, and special thank you to Amanda Troutman at Scholastic Inc. for setting up the interview. Be sure to follow YA Book Chat on Instagram and Facebook, and don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you get your episodes as soon as they are available. YA Book Chat was created by, is hosted and edited by me, Leah Stuhler.